Hello friends, so today for our nap time hustle, we are going to be making applesauce and apple butter because we have been going through it like crazy in our house and I would like to have some left over come January at least. So I went and picked the last of the apples off of my grandparents' apple trees and we are going to can some apple butter. I'm also going to make applesauce, but I probably won't show you as much of that process because it's very much the same. I just freeze it at a certain point. So come along today and see how I make my apple butter. The first thing that we need to do is chop up all of the apples, the best part being that we don't even have to core them. I just cut out the bad spots, slice them into eighths, and add them to our giant saucepan along with 2 cups of water and 1 cup of apple cider vinegar. Then I will place the lid on the pot and we will cook it at medium heat until the apples are nice and soft. When they finally get mushy, we will place them in the food mill and we will process them in order to make all of our applesauce. Processing the apples with the food mill will separate the soft sweet part of the apple from the peels, cores, and seeds. We will then have 8 cups of applesauce with which to add our spices to, and then we will put it back in our saucepan to cook it. The first thing we are going to add is 2 tablespoons of lemon juice for acidity. We are then going to add 2 teaspoons of ground cinnamon, followed by a half teaspoon of ground allspice and a half teaspoon of ground cloves. These seasonings really give it a fun fall flavor that will make your taste buds jump. This is where the recipes for applesauce and apple butter differ. For plain unsweetened applesauce, I would have stopped before I added the spices. For spiced applesauce, I will go ahead and add the cinnamon, cloves, allspice, and lemon juice. Then if I want sweeter applesauce, I will add 2 cups of sugar. But for apple butter, I am adding 4 cups of sugar. Then it is all stirred in and dissolved. Finally, I start the canning process by sterilizing my clean jars in the oven at 200 degrees Fahrenheit for 10 minutes. Then I will go ahead and fill the canner half full of water. It only needs to be a third full, but I end up using some of the water later with the lids and rings, so I want to prepare for losing water. And here is our apple butter all ready to be placed into jars. It is thick, it is sticky, and it is tasty. When working with water bath canning, it is important to make sure that everything is nice and hot. So what you see me doing here is taking my bowl of lids and rings and I am adding boiling water to them to warm them up. The jars that have been sterilized in the stove are still warm. I have not opened the oven, but I have shut it off because I know they will not cool off enough by the time I need to use them. Throughout this whole process, it is very important to make sure that you don't burn yourself. The canner is hot, the apple butter is hot, the water is boiling and steaming. Here you can see the apple butter actually splashing up out of the saucepan. My house was only 65 degrees when I started this process and 71 by the time that it was completed. So I am going to go ahead and use oven mitts to grab the jars out of the oven, and I will use my canning funnel to add the apple butter to the jars just up to the bottom of the screw top. When the jar has the appropriate amount of apple butter, I am going to go ahead and pound it on the counter a few times to try to release any air bubbles and make sure it is packed good and tight. If I need to add more apple butter, I will do so, but that has not been the case. I clean off the ring and make sure there is no apple butter on the edge of the jar. And then I am using this fancy magnet here to pull lids out of the boiling water so I don't burn myself. And I have to grab the jar with an oven mitt in order to tighten the lid. These are 8-ounce or half-pint jelly jars, and I have decided I actually do not like blue jars because when you fill them up, they just look brown. So I prefer the clear jars that you can see inside. If you have any questions about this canning process, please leave me a comment below and I will try to answer it as best I can. I am in no way an expert canner, but I have learned everything I know from my mother and my grandmother. The canner and the food mill that I am using in this video are actually both my mom's that I am currently borrowing from her as she has not been doing a lot of canning this season. I actually remember playing with them when I was a little girl and my mom was using them in her kitchen. So for me, this is kind of like carrying on some family traditions. And the first time I ever had apple butter, it was homemade by my grandmother. So this has kind of become a special process for me. Currently, I am adding all of the apple butter jars to the canner. You can see there is a wire rack inside, and this is what is preventing the cans from touching the water yet. And when it is lowered into the pan, it will prevent the jars from touching the bottom of the canner. Since these jars are so small, it is actually difficult to make sure they don't fall through the wire rack, and I also want to try to keep them from touching each other as we want the boiling water to be able to flow freely around the jars as they are placed down into the canner. I'm going to put the lid on and set the timer for 10 minutes. If the water is not boiling any longer, I will have to make sure that it begins again before I set the timer. Yes, my kids definitely woke up before this hustle was over. You can hear them in the background there, but the timer has gone off, so I'm going to go ahead and pull the jars out of the boiling water and set them on a towel on the counter. They will pop as they cool, which is the lids sealing themselves. It is definitely a satisfying sound to know that this process all worked, but I will go back and check about 15 to 20 minutes later to make sure that the lids did in fact all pop and seal. I do this by touching the top of the lid, and they should not be able to compress down. Our favorite way to enjoy apple butter is just like jelly on top of toast, but I also add it to oatmeal and our homemade yogurt, and I also have a recipe for a pork meatloaf that uses apple butter as well. Thank you for joining me on this process today, and if you liked this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Happy canning!